I had my whole day planned out. My flight was set to take off in 2 hours. And I was already at the airport, making my way through security. Everything was going smoothly, until it wasn't. "Ma'am, step aside," a gruff voice ordered. I turned to see 2 TSA agents eyeing me like I was carrying a bomb in my purse. One was a tall, bald white man with a gut that stretched his uniform just a little too tight. The other was shorter, leaner, with cold blue eyes that didn't blink enough. "Is there a problem?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Neither of them answered. Instead, the taller one, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, gestured toward a secondary screening area. I sighed and followed. This wasn't my first time dealing with extra security checks, but something about their energy felt off. The second I set foot in that screening area, things escalated. "Hands where I can see them," the shorter officer, Officer Miller, barked. "We need to check your bags." "For what?" I asked, frowning. Daniels smirked. "Drugs. Maybe stolen property. Who knows?" I felt my stomach tighten. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Miller stepped closer. "Lady, we got a tip. You fit the description." There it was. That vague, meaningless excuse I'd heard before. "And what description is that?" I challenged. Daniels exchanged a knowing glance with Miller before he turned back to me. "You're acting real defensive for someone with nothing to hide." "I'm acting like a person who knows this is nonsense," I shot back. That was enough for them. Before I could say another word, Daniels grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the counter. My purse was dumped out, my personal items scattered like trash. Miller dug through my things with deliberate roughness, unzipping every pocket, shaking out every piece of clothing, even flipping through my book as if I had something stashed inside. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Losing my temper would only make things worse. Passengers nearby slowed their steps, watching. Some whispered, others just kept moving, pretending they didn't see what was happening. "No drugs," Miller announced after a few minutes, his voice laced with disappointment. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe she swallowed him." Miller grinned. "Could be." And just like that, I was in handcuffs. I barely had time to process it before Daniels started walking me toward the airport police station. "You're under arrest for suspicion of drug smuggling," he said. "This is insane," I snapped. "I didn't do anything." "Tell it to the judge," Daniels sneered. Miller leaned in as we walked, lowering his voice just enough so only I could hear. "Welcome to the real world, sweetheart." I swallowed the anger burning in my throat. They thought they could do whatever they wanted. They thought I'd be too scared to fight back. They were wrong. The holding room was small, cold, and smelled like old coffee and bad decisions. A metal table sat in the center, with a single chair on either side. The walls were a dull, lifeless gray, like they were designed to make you feel powerless. I sat there, still in handcuffs, staring at the scuffed surface of the table, waiting. My flight was gone by now, my entire schedule ruined. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing these cops thought they'd won. The door swung open. Daniels strolled in first, followed by Miller. Daniels had a coffee in one hand, sipping it slowly, like this was just another day at the office. Miller had a folder under his arm, but I doubted there was anything real inside it. Daniels pulled out the chair across from me and sat down with a heavy sigh. "All right," he said, stretching like he was bored already. "Let's talk." I didn't say anything. I just stared. Miller leaned against the wall, flipping open the folder. "We got a tip about a woman smuggling drugs through this airport," he said, his tone as casual as if he were reading off a lunch menu. "Black female, late 20s, traveling alone. That sound like anyone we know?" I gave him a flat look. "You do realize how many women fit that description, right?" Daniels chuckled. "See, here's the thing," he said, tapping his coffee cup. "People who got nothing to hide usually cooperate." I raised an eyebrow. "Cooperate with what? You've already searched me. You found nothing." Miller clicked his tongue. "Not yet." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. "Let me guess. This is the part where you try to get me to confess to something I didn't do." Daniel smirked. "Confess? Nah." He glanced at Miller. "She thinks we need a confession." Miller grinned. "Ain't that cute?" I clenched my jaw, keeping my face neutral. They were playing games, trying to get under my skin. Daniels leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was letting me in on a little secret. You see, lady, we know how this goes. You can sit here and play tough. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. We can hold you as long as we want. Call it extended questioning. Maybe we find something, maybe we don't. But either way, you're not making that flight. And by the time you get out of here, you'll be begging to just walk away. I met his gaze unflinching. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Daniels grinned, but there was no warmth in it. Let's just say we've seen your type before. Miller pushed off the wall, stepping closer. And we know how this ends. I tilted my head. Yeah, well, so do I. Miller folded his arms. Is that right? That's right, I said, my voice steady. I'm filing a complaint. With the prosecutor's office. With internal affairs. Hell, with the damn media if I have to. Daniels whistled low. Damn. She's serious. Miller chuckled. You hear that? She thinks she's gonna fight back. Daniels took a slow sip of his coffee, then leaned in close, his breath reeking of cheap creamer. Listen, lady. Let me give you some free advice. You push this. You make waves. You're gonna regret it. 'Cause the thing is, we don't lose. Ever. Miller nodded, his smirk widening. And trust me, you do not want to find out what happens to people who try. They thought they had me cornered. They thought fear would keep me quiet. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They let me go hours later, after keeping me locked in that freezing room, for no reason other than to prove they could. No charges. No apology. Just a smug, drawn-out process meant to humiliate me. When they finally uncuffed me and shoved my things back into my hands, Daniel smirked. Enjoy the rest of your day, Miller added. And hey, think real hard before you go running your mouth. Could be the last mistake you make. I didn't say a word. I just grabbed my bag and walked out, my body vibrating with rage. By then my flight was long gone. My plans ruined. But that didn't matter anymore. They thought this was over. They had no idea I was just getting started. The next morning, I was in the prosecutor's office, filing my complaint. I laid it all out. How they falsely arrested me. How they humiliated me. The way they threatened me when I said I'd fight back. I made it clear that this wasn't just about me. These guys think they're untouchable, I told the investigator, a sharp-eyed black woman named Denise Carter. I guarantee you, I'm not the first person they've done this to. Denise nodded, flipping through my statement. You're right, she said. You're not. That got my attention. What do you mean? She let out a slow breath and shut the folder. Daniels and Miller have a history. Complaints have been filed before. But somehow nothing ever sticks. I clenched my jaw. Of course. Dirty cops like them always had the system covering for them. So what happens now? Denise's expression hardened. We open a case. And this time we do it right. I walked out of that office knowing one thing for sure. Those bastards had finally messed with the wrong person. It only took 3 days for Daniels and Miller to get the first hit of what was coming. I wish I could have seen their faces when they got that court summons. Because this wasn't just about my case. No, the prosecutors had dug deeper, way deeper. Turns out Daniels and Miller had dozens of complaints against them. Racial profiling, excessive force, falsifying reports. Cases that had been buried, ignored, or swept under the rug. Not this time. This time they were going to court. And the best part? They still had no idea who was waiting for them on the other side. Daniels and Miller strolled into the courthouse like they owned the place. Their suits were cheap, but their arrogance was expensive. They walked with that same cocky strut they had back at the airport, shoulders squared, chins up, like this was nothing but a formality. Like the system would work the way it always had. For them. Miller nudged Daniels as they passed through security. Look at this circus, he muttered, glancing at the reporters outside. All this over some whiny chick who couldn't handle airport security. Daniels snorted. It's pathetic. What's the judge gonna do? Slap us on the wrist? He adjusted his tie and smirked. We'll be back on duty by Monday. They were still laughing when they entered the courtroom. And then they saw me. I was already seated at the judge's bench, wearing the robe that symbolized real authority. My gavel rested on the desk in front of me. My nameplate was polished and clear for them to read. Judge Camille Dawson. Daniels froze mid-step. Miller's smirk disappeared so fast it was like someone had slapped it off his face. I didn't say a word. I let the moment stretch, let them take it in. The woman they had humiliated, mocked, and threatened was the judge presiding over their case. Miller's face turned a shade paler. No way. He turned to their lawyer, a gray-haired man who suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. This some kind of joke? The lawyer cleared his throat. It appears Judge Dawson has been assigned to this courtroom. Daniels shook his head, still trying to process what was happening. No, she can't do this. This is a conflict of interest. I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. You'll be relieved to know that I am not ruling on my own case, I said, watching them squirm. I recused myself from that one. But these charges. I gestured toward the thick case files stacked on my desk. These are about all your other victims. And I have full authority to oversee this trial. Daniel's jaw clenched. Miller swallowed hard. For the first time they looked worried. I leaned forward, folding my hands together. You once told me I'd regret fighting back, I said smoothly. That I'd find out what happens to people who make waves. I tilted my head. Well, gentlemen, I think it's time you find out what happens to your kind of people. I raised my gavel. The trial was about to begin. And this time, they weren't getting away. The moment I struck my gavel, the courtroom shifted. The arrogance in Daniels and Miller's eyes had been replaced with something else. Something they weren't used to feeling. Fear. Their lawyer was already scrambling. Your Honor, we motion for an immediate dismissal. Denied. I cut in smoothly. We're proceeding as scheduled. Miller stiffened. Daniels muttered something under his breath. They still hadn't fully accepted what was happening. But that would change soon enough. The prosecution started strong. The lead attorney, David Holloway, wasted no time laying it all out. Case after case, complaint after complaint. Victims who had been falsely arrested, brutalized, and intimidated into silence. Reports that had mysteriously disappeared. Investigations that had gone nowhere, because someone had always been there to protect these two. Not this time. The witnesses took the stand one by one. A young black man, trembling as he described how Daniels had slammed him to the ground for resisting, when he had done nothing but ask why he was being stopped. A middle-aged Latina woman, who had been pulled over by Miller and accused of driving a stolen car, her own car. An elderly man, his voice shaking as he recounted how they had handcuffed him for looking suspicious in his own neighborhood. Each testimony cut deeper, stripping away any illusion that Daniels and Miller were just good cops doing their jobs. They were predators, and for years, the system had let them hunt without consequence. But today was different. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face growing redder with every passing minute. Miller sat rigid, his hands balled into fists. Every once in a while, they shot me quick, nervous glances, as if still trying to convince themselves this wasn't real. But it was. And then the prosecution played the recordings. Security footage. Body cam clips that had somehow been lost, but had now been recovered. Their own words, their own sneering voices, their own brutal actions played for everyone to see and hear. There was Daniels, laughing as he shoved a teenager against a squad car. What you gonna cry, tough guy? There was Miller, telling a terrified woman. You wanna fight this? Go ahead. See what happens. There they were exposed. Miller's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously. Daniels just stared ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. They weren't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of their own crimes echoing through the speakers. I watched them closely. This was the moment they realized. They had spent their entire careers believing they were untouchable. But today, they were the ones with no way out. Daniels and Miller sat there, silent and stiff, as the courtroom absorbed the final piece of damning evidence. Their past victims had spoken, their cruelty had been recorded, and their lies had finally unraveled under the weight of the truth. Now it was time for them to answer for it. Their lawyer stood up, clearing his throat like a man who knew he had lost before he even started. Your Honor, these so-called accusations are being blown out of proportion. My clients are dedicated officers who... I raised a hand, cutting him off. Save it, counselor. My voice was calm, measured. We're not here for theatrics. I turned my gaze toward Daniels and Miller, who were avoiding eye contact, their confidence shattered. "We're here for justice." Daniels' mouth twitched, but he didn't speak. Miller sat so still he looked like he was hoping to disappear into the chair. I shifted my focus to the jury. Their faces said it all. They had seen enough, heard enough, felt enough. The verdict didn't take long. The jury filed back in after barely an hour of deliberation. The foreperson, a middle-aged black man in a crisp navy suit, stood tall as he read out the words Daniels and Miller never thought they'd hear. "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a few quiet cheers. Daniels shot up from his seat. "This is bullshit." His voice was thick with panic now, his cocky demeanor gone. "We did our jobs. We did what we were trained to do." Miller was breathing hard, his forehead beaded with sweat. This is a setup. A political stunt. Enough." My voice cut through their protests like a blade. The courtroom fell silent again. I stared them down, letting the weight of this moment settle in. "You abused your power," I said, my tone steady cold. "You hurt innocent people. You lied, you threatened, and you thought you'd never be held accountable." I leaned forward slightly. "But today you learned what real power looks like." Daniel shook his head, his face twisted in rage. Miller slumped back, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I picked up my gavel. "Officers Daniels and Miller," I said, savoring the last words they would hear before being led away in cuffs. "You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." The sound of the gavel striking the bench was final, definitive, and for the first time in their lives, Daniels and Miller had no escape. As they were escorted out, I watched them go. They had mocked me, humiliated me, told me I'd regret fighting back. But in the end, I was still here, and they were the ones losing everything. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.